Breaking news. Why do the Georgians think Russia invaded Ukraine? Although there are competing explanations for the conflict in Ukraine, the majority of Georgians blame Russia and Putin for the war, while a sizable minority blames the West. A verbal conflict has been ongoing since Russia invaded Ukraine a little over a year ago, with the general consensus being that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was completely unwarranted. However, the Russian government has promoted propaganda that falsely blames Ukraine for the conflict, calling the country's Jewish president a Nazi and insisting that it must be denazified to restore peace. How do people in Georgia feel about this, especially considering the country's complicated past with Russia? The majority of Georgians blame Russia as a whole, according to data from the CRRC Georgia and the National Democratic Institute's regular polling in Georgia, but a growing number of Georgians blame Vladimir Putin personally for the war. 1 in 6 Georgians blame some Western actor for the war, and 1 in 12 blame Ukraine, but the vast majority of the public blames Russia or Putin for the conflict. In the year following the war, the percentage of Georgians who blamed Russia and Putin for the conflict shifted, with the percentage blaming Russia falling from 67% in March 2022 to 54% in December 2022. Concurrently, the percentage of people who place the blame on Putin rose from 11% in March 2022 to 25% by December of that year. There is a sizable but vocal minority that holds Western countries accountable for the conflict in Ukraine. While only about 3% of people hold NATO and EU responsible for the situation, a much larger percentage hold the United States responsible. In March, 11% of those polled blamed the United States. By July and December, that number had increased to 15%. Similarly, only a minority of Georgians hold Ukraine responsible for the conflict. The percentage between these two shares was 5% in March 2022, 11% in July 2022, and 8% in December 2022. Remember that people could give up to 3 answers. Because of this, the total amount of shares may not add up to 100% on the above graph. Vladimir Putin was not specifically asked about in the initial survey, but respondents still identified him. Vladimir Putin was included as a choice in subsequent surveys. 59% of respondents in the most recent survey iteration blamed only Russia or Vladimir Putin for the conflict. 11% of respondents blamed only Western parties for the conflict. 7% more were able to name at least 2 actors, one from the West and one from Russia. The remaining 15% were either at a loss for words or flat out refused to answer. Others placed the blame on both Russia and the West for the situation in Ukraine. Who is to blame? According to the data, men, members of ethnic minorities, and supporters of the Georgian dream are more likely to hold the West, including the United States, the European Union, and NATO, at least partially responsible for the war than women, ethnic Georgians, and those who do not support the Georgian dream. Georgians of Russian ancestry, those who back the opposition, independents, and city dwellers are more likely to point the finger at Russia and/or Putin than their minority and rural counterparts. When compared to men, those with a secondary education, those living in Tbilisi, those with more wealth, and those supporting the opposition, women, those with a vocational education, those living outside of Tbilisi, and those supporting Georgian dream are more likely to be unsure about the causes of the war. There is no indication from the data that any subset is more or less likely to blame both Russia and the West for the conflict. Although few Georgians doubt Russia's responsibility for the conflict, the data do show that different demographics are more likely to attribute blame to Western actors or Ukraine itself. A sizable proportion is also still up in the air. Senior non-resident fellow at CRRC Georgia Dustin Gilbreth penned this article. The remaining 14 to 17% of the population either does not know or cannot pinpoint the cause of the war.